As a St. Louis resident, this city has been full of life when it comes to culture, inspiration, and music. My name is Kelly Ulrich. I'm a filmmaker who was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. For one of my college courses, my professor wanted us to do a documentary on something that was of importance to us. I decided to choose one specific place that makes me automatically think of St. Louis when someone asks me, "What's your favorite part about this city?" My first answer is always, vintage vinyl. Vintage vinyl has been the music mecca over the last 30 plus years in St. Louis, Missouri. Voted by USA Today as one of the 10 best record stores in the USA, Vintage Vinyl brings their own twist of tradition in the world of music, movies, and media memorabilia. Bands from all over the world have the chance to perform in this colorful and intimate venue to showcase their own music in a marvelous way. I had the chance to speak to one of my great and talented friends, Orlandez at his radio studio at KDHX in downtown St. Louis. Orlandez is a manager and marketing director at Vintage Vinyl. He grew up around the shop and was willing to tell me the history behind Vintage Vinyl and how they've survived so strongly through the years.
My name is Orlandez Lewis, and I am the Marketing and Promotions Director for Vintage Vinyl, and I am also a floor manager at Vintage Vinyl. I have been working at Vintage Vinyl now for 11 years. Yeah, time flies. What brought me to work at Vintage Vinyl was my father. I was 8 years old. I was digging into his record collection like crazy. It was just fascinating to me. It just, in the 90s, people were listening to CDs and tapes. My dad had a bunch of them, and I was just like, these things are amazing. What is this? And I was getting into his stuff, and then eventually he was just like, let me take this kid over here to this store. I think he might dig it. And I was 8, and I got my first record from there. Yeah, The Jackson's Victory was my first album. Vintage Vinyl opened in 1980. It was two owners, Tom Ray and Lou Prince. They first started selling albums in the Soulard market, and once that kind of got a little bit too narrow and they kind of had to spread their wings a little bit, they started selling records in the Delmar Loop. Not at the location that it's in now, but in another location kind of further down the street that still was a little bit more smaller. And again, records, they grow. So they started accumulating more albums, and then they were like, hey, we got to find somewhere else. And then in 1990, I believe, they moved to the location they're at now, which is 6610 Delmar. When I first started working there, it was 2009, so I want to say I had never really experienced any downfall, but there was, of course, the period of the beginning of the iPod and digital music and streaming and everything, and I would say that was maybe circa 2004, 2005, and I just know kind of I was doing a lot of reading and stuff at that time, and a lot of stores were starting to suffer because, people, again, had portable players and they were able to access music on their own, and they didn't necessarily need stores. So a lot of stores did experience a bit of a downfall with that era, and I believe Vintage was kind of the same. Again, I started shopping there in 1998, so I was still shopping there in high school, and I kind of noticed that it was a little bit of a decrease. People weren't into the racks as much like I was. I was still dedicated, but I didn't really see too many other people that were there. But over the years, though, it has began to, spiral, which is good. iTunes was the first big streaming media really that became like a download service, and then you had Rhapsody and all that kind of stuff. I don't really know necessarily if there was anything pertaining to those software that we necessarily were kind of like, oh, this is a good thing about. If anything, it was kind of more just like, what do we do about these guys? Music is my life, for sure. I mentioned my dad earlier. He was the biggest influence of my life, not only just on a personal level, but just on a musical level. He put me on to everything. He's the reason why I started working at Vintage Vinyl, and the reason why I have a radio show as well here in St. Louis. But just to kind of go back to Vintage Vinyl, though, just walking in there, constantly. I remember me and my dad had a bond over it, but my mom and my sisters, on the other hand, they liked music, but it wasn't like how me and him did. So it would be a different dichotomy whenever we would go in, because me and my dad would come in and we'd stay for hours. Me and my mom and my sisters, on the other hand, they would be like, we need to go. So, it was a little bit different because I was that kid to where I would go from Michael Jackson to Santana to the Rolling Stones, back to Miles Davis, and then back to the Jay-Z section. And that's the beautiful thing about just not only vintage vinyl, but record stores in general. There's something for everybody. And that's what I love about working there still, because, every Saturdays are the best days, because everybody from different ages, cultures, creeds, they all come by and they check out our selection. And it's just a beautiful thing. You see people everywhere. That's great. Future, I say, is very promising. Again, I'm seeing a lot more people. It was a bit of a rarity when I was a kid coming in at 8 or 9 years old, but I'm seeing that become the norm now. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I think that's a beautiful thing, seeing a lot more younger people getting into it, teenagers now buying turntables. That's a great thing. I didn't get teased about it as a teenager, but I also just used to get like, dude, why are you hauling around these big things and you could be listening to music on your iPod, And I'm like, because it's the texture of it. People are finally starting to get that aspect. And I'm really, again, just grateful for that. And I'm glad to see that vintage vinyl has an ongoing future because of that, and because we're able to provide that service and what the people want. And I'd say that's going to be the future of vintage vinyl, and I hope that stays that way.
Overall, vintage vinyl has overcome decades of changes within the music industry, whether it comes to the new waves of technology or societal standards of what music is. Vintage vinyl has been an extremely successful small business, and I don't think business will stop booming anytime soon.